Hello, welcome to Thor Talk, the show all about Marvel's resident god of thunder. On this episode of Thor Talk, we're going to be examining Norse mythology. Obviously, Marvel's Thor has blonde hair, but typically the Thor of Norse myths is considered to have red hair. But that may not have always been the case. So let's take a look on Thor Talk.
I am Thor the Thunderer, son of Odin, prince of Asgard, and this world is under my protection.
For the sake of accuracy, most of my information will come from an article by Dr. Carl E. H. Siegfried. Now, before we begin, I am not for a second suggesting that Thor having red hair is wrong. I'm merely putting forth the idea that Thor didn't always have red hair in Norse mythology, or at least that there is no proof of such a fact. You see, there actually seems to be no direct reference of a red-haired Thor from an early Norse pagan perspective. The red-haired Thor seems to have actually originated from a Christian perspective. Rudolf Meisner's Die Kenningar der Skalden provides an exhaustive list of kennings, or poetic phrases in Scandinavian poetry, that date back to approximately 850 AD, meaning they even predate the Eddas. In all of these kennings, there is no reference of Thor having red hair, so there is no claim of a red-haired Thor in these older Norse writings. The Eddas are some of the oldest and most important sources of Norse mythology. Despite what many claim, there is no direct reference to a red-haired Thor in the Eddas either. Even Andy Orchard seems to have misquoted the Eddas in his Dictionary of Norse Myth and Legend, as he writes, "Physical descriptions of Thor are few. According to the Eddic poem Thrimskriva, however, he has a bristling red beard, piercing, frightening eyes when roused, and a frightening appetite." But if you actually look at the poem, there is no mention of the color of Thor's beard. The text actually reads, "Thor was angry when he awoke, and missed his hammer. His beard bristled, his hair stood on end. The son of earth began to grope about." One of the Eddas does at one point describe Thor's hair in Snorri's Prose Edda. It says about Thor that his hair is fairer than gold. However, this definition of fair more likely means beautiful than light in color. Also, the Eddas refer to gold as red wealth, but there are also other poetic verses that refer to it as yellow amber and red fire. So there's an argument for both blonde and red-haired based on this statement. The first reference to a red-bearded Thor is in the sagas, which were written well after the Eddas and the kennings collected by Rudolf Meisner. The sagas' accounts of a red-bearded Thor are strongly in a Christian context, portraying Thor as a god of a bygone era whose time is long past. In Eric the Red saga, a Thor-worshipping Viking named Thorhall refers to Thor as Old Redbeard. In Olaf's saga, Thor appears as a demonic entity who seems young, powerfully built, and red-bearded. In the Flómana saga, Thorgils is one of the first to be converted to Christianity in Iceland, and Thor appears in his dreams as a large and red-bearded man who threatens to turn him back to the old pagan religions. So the first traceable appearances of Thor's red beard appear in the sagas that date from 1220 AD to 1350 AD, rather than in the earlier mythological sources from 850 AD to 1220 AD. As French scholar Georges Dumézil writes, whereas the Edda presents Thor as a man in the prime of life, the Lapp tradition, in accord with several popular Norwegian expressions, makes him an old man with a red beard. It is very possible that Thor had a red hair in the original Norse myths, but it appears that all proof of such a claim originates in a Christian context. The Norsemen didn't really write their stories and myths down, but rather passed them down verbally. The only reason we know as much about Norse mythology as we do is because Christians wrote these stories down. But it was not an uncommon practice for Christians to slightly change the Norse stories when they wrote them down. It's why Beowulf spends such an unusual amount of time praising God despite the fact that he should probably be a Norse pagan. Similarly, it is quite likely that the authors of the sagas chose to portray Thor as a god with red hair whose time is long past. In many cultures, red hair has many negative connotations. However, it is worth pointing out that the Norsemen may not have had the same negative association with red hair. Many Norsemen had red hair, and giving Thor red hair could be a sign of his fiery temper. So it is entirely possible that the Thor of Norse myth did have red hair. But the only instances of a red-haired Thor seem to originate from a Christian perspective. So, did Thor of Norse mythology have blonde or red hair? I think the answer is simply both. Again, the Norsemen chose to pass down stories verbally to each other, and with such a method, not every account of these stories would be exactly alike. There was no Bible of Norse mythology, there was no Iliad or Odyssey, there were no definitive stories that were entirely correct. To some, Thor had red hair, and to others, he may have had blonde hair. Thor was as he was thought to be, and there was likely no definitive answer. Well, that's all for this episode of Thor Talk. If you want to keep up with and support Thor Talk, simply subscribe. Once again, I'd like to formally state that all art and video is owned by its respective companies, and I own none of it. With that said, see you next time on Thor Talk, where
You'll behold in breathless wonder.